The Panasonic GH6, we have been waiting a while for this. I haven't been this excited for a micro four thirds camera since like over 10 years ago when I got my very first mirrorless camera, which was the GH2. I actually feel like Panasonic doesn't get enough credit for how much they really push the video in these mirrorless cameras. Like, they're giving us 10-bit codecs in the GH5 way before Sony and Canon. Now, they've told me that there is a brand new sensor in here that's really supposed to deliver really great image quality that really addresses a lot of the issues we might have had with smaller sensors like a micro four thirds in the past. This camera has been amazing. I actually really liked using it. It very much feels like a video first mirrorless hybrid. I think if you have a background in pro video or cinematography, there are tons of things in this camera that you will also very much appreciate it, but contrast-based autofocus. Now, I will say this is the best contrast-based autofocus that I've ever used, but if you're gonna compare it to like IBIS or Canon's dual pixel, what the f? It's not as good as Sony's or Canon's autofocus is what I'm trying to say. So let's go ahead and start at the top with the unboxing.
This isn't the smallest mirrorless camera, but you can see that there's a fan right there. I also have lens straps, also got a battery, USB-C cables, comes with an external charger. I think this is for time code. Kit lens, a 12-60, and since it's micro four thirds, it's a 2x crop factor. So it is easier to calculate. There are also some other more interesting lenses, like this right here is a 10-25, so that's a 20-50 equivalent. But check it out, f1.7 all the way through, and same with this is a 25-50, so equivalent that would be 50-100. But that is the benefit of smaller sensors, is you could get some pretty awesome spec lenses to go with it. I like this, check it out. You get that full articulation, but you still get to pop it out like some of the Sonys. Dual card slots, CFast Express, and an SD card. And this is, I believe, the Type B? No, this is Type A. I mix the two up all the time, but it's the one that is bigger than an SD card. I do like that the mic jack is all the way up here, so it never really gets in the way of the screen. We also have, of course, our headphone jack. That is important. And also USB-C to charge, or you can also plug in an SSD, full-size HDMI. It does also come with the safety bracket, so if somebody comes and trips on the HDMI cable, you're not gonna destroy that port. Although this might just cause it to just tip over the tripod and smash it against the ground. Now, before I start dialing anything in, I'm just gonna hit record with its default setting. Let's see how everything auto looks. There's no ND filter, so shutter speed's off the chain. But you know what? This autofocus isn't terrible. Check that out. I'm gonna go back on carry. ASPH. Is that aspherical? Is that what that means? Oh man, it feels good, and the weight's not terrible. But I mean, like a 25-50. They literally look the same. Now I got the 25-50 mil on here. I hate auto exposure, but you know, the IBIS is definitely working here, because I am at a 50 mil, which is a 100 mil equivalent, and there is no stabilization in this lens. Now I'm trying out the 10-25, so 20-50, and can I vlog on this right here? How's this looking? It's still driving me crazy that I'm on auto exposure and auto everything. Chicky, what do you think? Should I become a Panasonic guy with micro four thirds? I've always respected Panasonic a lot because they bring a lot of really good features like waveform. This camera has waveform built in, all right? Anamorphic settings and ProRes.
You're legit excited, huh?
I am actually. The standard color and the auto exposure was driving me crazy. So I got the ND on here, manual exposure. Here, I'm gonna go ahead and steal this microphone here. And how does it look? I got my microphone plugged in. I see my audio levels and everything. I'm recording in Vlog, so it's flat, and then I color grade it, and I do like Panasonic colors. Did I lose a little bit of autofocus right there? Now, even though I'm much more of a video guy than a photographer, there are a few things in here that are really cool. For example, with the mechanical shutter, I could get to 1/8000th of a second, which is what the Sony a7S does. I can switch over to the electronic shutter and get to 1/32,000th of a second. So if you're trying to shoot at like an f1.2 on a really sunny day, then you can do that by just tightening up the shutter. With continuous autofocus, I could get 7 shots a second, and go. And the focus kept up with you, so that's good. Now, if I could get away with single point autofocus and have carry run parallel to me, I can get 14 frames per second on the mechanical shutter.
And this is where things get really exciting. And go. Now that digital sound that this camera makes isn't actually a good representation of how many shots are being taken every second, because I actually counted it out and it's about 15 shots per second, but this is doing 75 frames per second, all with JPEGs and 25.2 megapixel RAW files. For every second you hold this shutter down, it's gonna be over 3 gigs of data. So use it wisely. It does fill up the buffer after a burst, but this is how many shots I can get in one go. There's 31 photos between the start and finish of her jump.
Oh, poor Cheeky.
Oh, she got scared. There's some serious horsepower in here. Now we go one more click over, and this is the high resolution mode, which will get us 100 megapixel photo. It does this by taking a photo, and the IBIS shifts the image just slightly. You know, the thing that usually stabilizes your image. It basically moves it, takes a handful of shots, compiles it, and gives you 100 megapixel shot. Best case scenario is having it on a tripod and taking a photo, something that's not moving. But now there is a handheld high res mode, which sounds like it takes more images and compiles that. Also, the IBIS on here is amazing. I took a photo handheld with the shutter open for an entire second, and it actually came out pretty sharp, which blew my mind. Okay, I might have embellished this image a little bit using our sponsor software, Luminar Neo. So here's the original photo right here, and still a 1 second shutter. You can see all that detail in the palm trees. Sky replacement is not something that I do all the time, but it's just so easy with one clip that sometimes I just can't help myself. Okay, so here's a photo of Dylan. We took this at ISO 1600 at 38 mil on the GH6, so that's what, like 76 mil equivalent, and of course f1.7 to get that bokeh. But let's say we want a little bit more portrait bokeh. I think this is one of the new features here, and we can go ahead and add it. Now, I didn't tell Luminar where Dylan is or anything like that. I just slid it across. That's it, one click, and check that out. It isolated Dylan and blurred out the background. So now the bokeh is even softer. And if it doesn't get it perfect, we can always go in and refine that mask. Now, one of the things that's coming out in a future update is the ability to just remove the background. So that's something that I'm excited for. Just think about how long it would take to make this mask manually, right? Another new feature is relight. So check it out. We can adjust our brightness near. So this will brighten or darken down Dylan. We could also adjust our brightness in the distance. And again, all I'm doing is just moving some sliders back and forth. That's it. Another thing that's to do are layers. So we can go in and add some flares if we want to on top of the image. Oh, how about some sparklers? Let's see how, ooh, oh, the hearts. Wow. I don't know how Dylan's gonna feel about me editing hearts over his face. How about just some stardust bokeh? Oh, check this out. This is one of the 100 megapixel photos, and I have noticed it does tend to bring in quite a few more details and just sharpens things up. But also, I did this at a 10 millimeter, and it seems to have trouble lining things up around the edges. So it seems like you're gonna have a better time using that mode with a tighter lens. But good thing is they always give you a standard raw image to go along with it in case you run into issues. And of course, it wouldn't be properly Luminar without those smart presets and templates. Now, all the photos have been shot on the GH6, but I pulled up this one photo from the iPhone just to test out this new feature under Erase. You remove power lines, and boom, check that out. There's also dust spots in case you get some dots on your sensor. Now, thanks again to Skyline for sponsoring this episode. Links down there in the description if you want to try it out. You could buy out the software outright, or there's also a subscription plan which will hook you up with future updates. 30-day money back guarantee also. All right, I think it is time to get down and dirty with more GH6 footage. So this clip here is 5.7K ProRes 422 HQ. Oh my gosh, I hear my hard drives over there shaking. Right now we have it at 24 and 30 frames per second, but firmware update coming that will give us DCI 4K or full HD, which seems a little bit more manageable. Here's a little sharpness test with the A7S on the right, and you can kind of see the 45 mile per hour speed limit here, but you can't really see it on the Sony. And then we go in even closer to 1000%. You can really make out those cables easier than you can on the 4K. So it does make a difference. Oh, look at that, almost 2000 megabits per second. Now keep in mind this is megabits. See how it's a lowercase speed? That's megabits. If you want to convert to megabytes, you divide it by 8. So basically a gig every 4 seconds. So just Be prepared. Now this shot that you're looking at right now is 50 megabits per second. Usually I do 100, but I'm trying out 50 because I can record for like hours just talking about this stuff. The GH6 also does have some compressed H.265 stuff. Now these shots are a little bit shaky. It's because I turned off all stabilization in both these cameras and it was really windy up there. But since it's 5.7K, I could stabilize it and not worry about that resolution loss. And then you can just zoom all the way out and show the rest of the frames. There's also some intra and long GOP MOV files that are a good balance of quality and file size here. And we can get 4K 120, and we are getting this out of a camera that costs $21.99. So basically $2,200, which I think is actually very reasonable. If you're a fan of like the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema cameras, then I feel like this GH6 kind of feels like that, where it gives you a lot of the cinematographer tools, but also gives you IBIS and autofocus. Now the autofocus does work in this 4K 120 mode, and I believe it stops right at 200 frames per second. So yes, this can give 200 frames per second. This could actually go 300 frames per second in HD. And this is with no additional crop, 10-bit color in vlog. So this is all flat footage that I'm grading with their LUT. I'm not doing any sort of creative color grading to this. I'm just applying the LUT so you can just kind of see how it looks, and you can of course tweak it from here to your liking. But at 300, you are looking at a long GOP codec and not an intra codec. It still looks pretty good, but if you want intra, you can go to 240 frames per second HD. So now we have a 10-bit 422 intra codec at 240 frames per second. And what's interesting about this mode is you can shoot it as a regular video clip. So it comes in at real time, includes audio, but you can just slow it down to 10% whenever you want. This is just QuickTime Player here. Now again, all the slow motion is with no crop, but there's some settings like this 4K 120 where you can crop in to pixel if you want to in the camera, but I generally leave the image area to full. Now this 4K 120 is long GOP, but if you want an intra codec, then you can get your 4K 60 422. This all I codec is 600 megabits per second, but if you're good with long GOP, then it's going to reduce your file size in about a third. Another advantage of the long GOP is that you can actually go 5.7K 60 frames per second, and even that is only 300 megabits per second. So you're getting more resolution at half the file size when you compare it to intra. Now let's look at the autofocus. So here is a shot of Dylan just stepping in at f1.7. Pretty solid. They told me that there is 3 times more processing power compared to what we used to have. And I was actually impressed at how well it was able to track some of these shots. But as soon as you do some of those quicker moves, it does get a bit trickier. So here we are on the tighter lens, the 25 to 50. So of course, 50 to 100 equivalent. And you can see it's just not grasping on as good. Like there, it's got him. And the tricky part is once it loses the subject, it can take a while for it to feel like it can grab him back, opposed to the Sony or Canon where it'll just go whoosh and bring it right back instantly. Like sometimes I'll just reframe real quick and then I just kind of have to wait a little while for it to catch up. So if you were hoping the autofocus to be amazing, then this is unfortunately not going to be the camera for you. Here, I'll take this GH6 with the f1.7 and I will swap it out with the Sony. Here we go. Now we are on the GH6. So let me go close. And see, it's pretty stable and you don't see too much of the background doing too much of that pulsing. Is it doing it? Here, let me show you what I'm talking about. So here is a shot of Dylan. You could almost kind of see that like all of these lights back here are kind of doing this pulsing where it gets a little bit bigger and smaller. And I think that's the contrast-based autofocus working there. And of course, it's going to change sizes when Dylan scoots forward. But even when he locks into one position, you just see it kind of doing this very little shrinking, getting bigger. So the bigger that bokeh gets in the back, the more obvious it seems to get. Here with this shot, I think with this amount of blur, I think we're okay. I'm not noticing it much on this display here. And you'll see that as soon as I pop the camera into manual focus, you'll just see it instantly just stop. It's nice and stable now. And same type of shot with the A7S. You could see that it just has one gradual shift in focus, and once it locks on, it just sits there. This is just something that's really obvious when you get those blurred out lights in the background. But when you don't have that bokeh in the background, it seems like that pulsing is pretty invisible. Now you can go in and customize some parameters in the autofocus by adjusting the speed and sensitivity. Slow it down, it does seem to do that pulsing thing less, but it also is a lot slower in focusing. When you bring it up, it does become a bit more obvious. And for a while, I had everything set at the max, and I shot this scene in the last video. But if you look here on the top left, you can see that it seems much more aggressive in that search for focus. So why didn't they go with like face detection or dual pixel autofocus? Well, don't quote me on this because I'm not some fancy smart guy engineer dude, but I do believe that those things do take up space on the sensor. So my guess is that it's just optimizing the amount of space on that sensor for best image quality. And how's my autofocus been? Has it been decent so far? Hasn't been drifting off too much? And Micro Four Thirds in the past hasn't been that impressive in low light, but here is ISO 1600, bringing it up to 3200, where we start to see some noise, 6400, and finally 12,800, which is the highest ISO that I personally have ever hit. As long as you have some sort of ambient light, you can still walk away with some pretty clean stuff. So how does it compare to the full frame A7S III? So here they both are at ISO 3200. I'm going to boost the exposure in post just so we could see what kind of noise is in there. Here we are again at ISO 6400, and I'm going to boost that gain again, and check that out. I think the GH6 actually looks cleaner. And then finally 12,800, where the A7S dual native ISO kicks in, and you can't really beat the A7S there. But remember, with Micro Four Thirds, you're usually walking away with a faster lens, so you usually don't have to get all the way up there. Now, if you're interested in using some manual focus cine lenses that are Super 35 or full frame, you can use something like this speed booster 0.71x, and these do give us more light. It says here can increase one stop, so you can go ahead and cut your ISO in half. If we're a 2x crop on here and then you multiply that by 0.71, so now your crop factor is like 1.42. So it's not full frame, but it's larger than most Super 35s out there. So I actually have it here. Should we try it out? This is what 35mm looks like without a speed booster, and this is what 35mm looks like with a speed booster. So we get that wider field of view. So it's looking good, but one issue I'm having is that I'm having a hard time hitting infinity focus. So if that's the case, I heard you can actually take this element and actually turn it. Is it actually turning? Oh, it is turning. I'm not sure which way I'm supposed to turn it exactly, but I guess we'll find out if it gets better or worse. All right, so trying this again. So we're going over to infinity, and the focus got past infinity.
You mean like past infinity and beyond?
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, exactly. It's not trademarked, right?
Are you proud of yourself, Dylan?
Very proud. It's what I came here today to do. Just that.
Just that one line?
Yeah, I'm gonna.
Are you gonna go home now?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for the help, Dylan.
All right, took a little bit of trial and error, but I think we're looking pretty good here. Definitely getting some really shallow depth of field here. Now I want to try out this 50-100 f1.8 all the way through. This is an APS-C lens, and it seems like it's working. I'm not really seeing the edges, and I have all stabilization turned off. So this is cool, and with the adapter, I can adjust the aperture still electronically. And I'm gonna try to hold it still. Too shaky. And now I'm gonna go ahead and turn on just the IBIS. Now this lens is not stabilized. Holy crap. This is nothing but IBIS. No digital image stabilization. That is some next level IBIS right there. All right, now I'm gonna turn on E-stabilization as well as boost stabilization. So this is gonna utilize some of the gyro data and digitally stabilize. So this is a lens with no image stabilization all the way in at 100, so about 140. Wow, let's see what happens if I turn on the autofocus. Okay, the box is forming around Dylan's head right there, but I don't think you're gonna wanna use autofocus unless it's a native lens. So that's really cool to know that you could use cine lenses that have zero stabilization, throw it on here, and you can just handhold the thing. Look at that, massive cruise ship. But here, I wanna try this out now. This is the lens that's an optional kit lens, and this one has image stabilization on here. So all stabilization is off. We get a 12 to a 60 mil, so 24 to 120. So I'm gonna leave it at 60 mil, and I'm gonna turn on the optical image stabilization, so the lens and IBIS in 3, 2, 1.
Oh my gosh. Now I kind of feel like this GH6 and speed booster combo deserves its own video, because if you think about it, it's got the power of a cinema camera but paired with the great IBIS. The crop factor is now closer to Super 35, and some of you may be hoping for a full frame look, but Super 35 is still kind of king in the cinema world. You know, more people are shooting with the Super 35 Area Alexas than the Alexa LF. And on top of that, if you still wanted to, you still can vlog on this camera. Not the best vlogging camera, but you can do it. And our whole interface with the camera is awesome. We have our white balance, ISO, and I programmed this button right here to be my waveform. It is so much nicer exposing with waveform than histogram, so thank you for making it accessible with just one button. And you know this is a video first camera because check that out, an audio button right here. Now inside of here I have my audio controls as well as the limiter, which I feel like all mirrorless cameras need to have, so in case you peak, it's not going to sound as harsh. You'll also see that there is a 4-channel input option, so of course you have your 2 channels here in the stereo mic input, but you also can get that XLR adapter and get 2 additional channels, so you could have 2 lavaliers going, a boom mic and like a room tone or whatever. Like, you got options here. And also with the built-in fan, you're not going to be running into overheating issues. Now I did torture it enough for it to overheat at 107 degrees, but under normal use I think you're gonna be fine. I still think they're trying to figure out exactly what temperature it can go up to before it just will not overheat ever, and I think it was around 95 degrees, but don't quote me on that. I think they're still figuring that out. But I did try to torture this thing at 4K 120 and it had no issues. Now I did run into a few card write speed issues on the higher ProRes settings. There's probably just something weird going on with my CF Express card. I still have yet to try it on other CF Express cards. Also, this has got to be one of my favorite menus. Everything that I want is in here, but it's not overloading. Everything makes sense, so I love that. And check this out, we have our shutter angle right here. So 180 degree shutter is where I usually like to leave it. I also spent some time programming in my quick menu, so here I can adjust my exposure mode. So manual's usually where I have it, but sometimes I might go into shutter priority if I kind of want the camera to do some of the exposing for me. And then here are my favorite frame rates. There's so many different codecs and frame rates and options to choose from, so you can always take your favorites and save it under my list right here, and then you could always access that through your quick menu right here. I want to jump into ProRes, boom, now in ProRes, and then let's say 4K 120. Now I'm in 4K 120, 240. Like, I love how quickly I can adjust, and I don't have to adjust my shutter speed whenever I switch frame rates, because the shutter speed is going to automatically be double my frame rate, which is awesome. And I can always adjust that shutter angle if I need to tweak that in case I want to change color profiles, but I'm almost always in vlog. I can also turn the LUT on and off, which is useful. This is dynamic range boost, which we will get into in a second. That is a very cool option. And then here I put our 3 different levels of stabilization. So this is just IBIS right here, and then this is the slight crop for digital stabilization, and this is the boost. Also, this is really cool right here, luminance spot meter. So if I turn that on, you'll see it drops a little box right there, and I can adjust to where I want that exposure. So right now the ground right there is exposed, and if I want to expose more for the sky right there, it'll tell me what my exposure is on that specific spot, which is a really cool feature. And finally, anamorphic D-squeeze display. Yes, we can display the D-squeeze in camera, which is awesome. I don't know how many mirrorless cameras can do that, but 0.3, 0.33, 0.5, 0.8, and 2x right here in camera, which is awesome. Also, check this out, on certain lenses like this one, I can adjust if I want that focus ring to be linear or non-linear, which takes into account the speed of rotation, but I keep it on linear. But also, look at this, you can adjust how much throw you want that focus ring to have. So if we could go all the way over to 1080, so that would mean it would take multiple rotations to get through. And I guess this is popular for macro work, but usually you don't need it all the way there. You can probably just keep it at like 270. That's pretty comfortable right there. Another feature that's kind of cool is that there is a 5.8K mode, but it is a 4:3 aspect ratio. This is usually used for anamorphic lenses where you're going to stretch out the image anyways, but this uses the entire sensor. So if you're a fan of anamorphic lenses, then you are probably jumping for joy right here. It's like open gate basically. Also, I started recording on the app here, so that might have been a good chance to actually test out this limiter on this camera. So I'm going to talk really loud. So the audio levels were like
So I don't know, how did that sound? So now I've got it off, so now I'm just gonna talk really loud again and see how it sounds. It probably sounds not as good. But having an app where you can view your feed live is always kind of useful. Now I'm personally primarily like a Sony and a little bit of Canon user, but I'm curious what the Panasonic users are gonna think about this GH6. So I got a buddy, Daniel, over in Houston, who says he's not a Panasonic fanboy, but
I have the GH5, GH5S, and the S5, G9, and the GX8.
Wait, you have 5 Panasonic cameras?
I actually have two S5s too, so...
Oh my god, you didn't think like, maybe I'll just get one Sony or one Canon. You're just like, nope.
You know, I started off in Micro Four Thirds, and then I started photos from my own listings. So as you know, I'm actually a realtor by trade. And then of course that led into videography. So I guess I was kind of married into the Micro Four Thirds lens system. Probably the biggest thing for me though is probably the image stabilization. I mean, it's absolutely fantastic. You know, I've tried other cameras before and it's not quite the same, especially on the Micro Four Thirds line.
Have you heard any of the rumors about the GH6?
Yes.
Look what I got here, huh? Oh, price range, what are you thinking?
I mean, I hope they don't go over 3,000.
$21.99.
$21.99. Really?
Yeah. Oh, okay, so that's good.
Crap, I got some GH5 Pass going on eBay tonight. I'm pleasantly surprised.
Interested? Not so interested?
Yeah, for the price, without a doubt. I mean, again, autofocus. But again, my more recent stuff, I've been getting away from that. I've been manually focusing, so I'm learning to not rely on that. But yeah, for the price, I was honestly thinking it'd be closer to 3,000. You know, with my S5, I got to put my Ninja V on there to get ProRes. GH6, I mean, it's all in one little body. If I already have a good Micro Four Thirds lens, 42.5 or whatever, 1.2 I think it is, then the 10 to 25. And then adding the new 25 to 50, for the most part, that would have covered all my needs. That would have amazing glass.
42.5 f1.2. So you like that lens. And it has image stabilization?
Yeah.
What? Okay, yeah. That's like the beauty of smaller sensors. You get lenses like this. And of course, there's anamorphic lenses. There's a lot hitting the market that are actually affordable now. And just having that compatibility built into the camera and not have to carry around an external monitor or anything like that makes it really fun to shoot with. So this is what it'll look like if I decide to shoot this setup with a 1.33D squeeze. And it looks pretty cool. I just have to make sure I don't drift out of focus. And it does have its own stabilization in anamorphic mode. So for example, you can't stabilize the roll with anamorphic, right? Because then you're going to see those flares start moving around once it's stabilized. And since anamorphic lenses usually can't communicate to the camera what focal length it is, that is something that the stabilization does need to know. So when you fire up the camera, it will ask you what focal length is this. I just told it 35 mil. It takes that into account, which is so cool. Stabilized anamorphic lenses. Another thing that's really cool is they have a mode called dynamic range boost. I think this is kind of their version of dual gain output, where it records the highlights and shadows and then remixes it to give you clean shadows and a lot of information in the highlights. The catch is that you have to shoot at ISO 2000 if you're going to shoot in vlog. I think there's other color profiles where you can have that base at 800. All right, so here we have the dynamic range boost on the right. Now let's go up to 3 stops overexposed. And what's interesting is we're able to recover some of those buildings right there when we have that dynamic range boost on, but we totally lose it without it. So we're definitely getting more dynamic range with the same exposure. So that is definitely a big plus. But since we are having to shoot at ISO 2000, I am noticing more noise than if I shot without it at ISO 800. For example, here you can see that even though we get more dynamic range, we are seeing more noise just because we're shooting at ISO 2000. Here's another example. I had to ND this down to get that ISO 2000. And we take a closer look and you definitely see quite a bit more noise in the sky with the dynamic range boost on. But what if you're shooting in low light and you're gonna go past 2000 anyways? Like here we are at ISO 6400. So in this case, I would probably just go ahead and turn it on because the noise kind of feels tighter to me. So with the dynamic range boost on, how's it compared to the Sony a7S III, which has amazing dynamic range? If we go all the way down to -5 stops, I feel like we actually get more shadows out of the GH6. And when we go overexposed, where the Sony's really good, you'll see that between 3 and 4 stops is when the buildings kind of disappear. And if we go all the way over to 6 stops over, I'm actually able to recover some of these plants right here, while the Sony, I just can't. It's kind of out of its boundaries there. So the dynamic range you're getting out of the DR boost is no joke. So once you understand this camera, you realize, okay, it's probably not the best autofocus, vlog and run and gun type of camera, but if you could live within its limitations, it gets really exciting when I can press a button and check my waveforms and then just hop into 300 frames per second without having a crop, and then just pop in on an anamorphic lens and being able to pair that with great IBIS, and also 4 audio channels if you get that XLR adapter. It's user friendly, it's fun, it's got IBIS, it's got great stabilization, and still has usable autofocus. Anyways, I've been talking for way too long. I thought this was gonna be a 15-minute video, but the features just kept coming and coming. Oh my God, I'm exhausted. End tag time. Let's just get it over with. Just get the suggested videos and the subscribe button somewhere floating around. Links down there in the description and all that stuff. And good night.